Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're zooming in from. My name is Mary Biddle Koenig, and I am the program manager of the Smith Enterprise Risk Consortium at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. I would like to welcome you to our second webinar of 2023 in our Risk Leadership Series. And this webinar will be focusing on the exciting topic of managing AI in the medtech sector. Just a few housekeeping items before we get going. First, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website shortly. So if you don't consent to the recording, you can go ahead and drop off now. And also thank you all to all of you who gave us questions as you came into the registration process. We're going to do our best to address those questions during the course of the webinar. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A. And we will, like I said, based on timing, we'll do our best to incorporate those into the conversation. Now, I would like to turn it over to our co-host, Robert E. Amazo at ZRG Partners, to get us started.
Thank you, Mary Biddle. Robert E. Amazo with ZRG Partners, and my practice is focused across enterprise risk and analytics as the global practice leader. Would like to thank my partner, Scott Jackson, who's a part of the life sciences practice, as well as the enterprise risk functional practice, who's helped introduce us to Abhi Gandhi here. And certainly would like to welcome you all, which is our inaugural discussion on enterprise risk within the life sciences and pharma space. We're really excited to continue the partnership with now the Smith Enterprise Risk Consortium, and would certainly like to welcome and turn this over to Professor Cliff Rossi, and also a big welcome to Abhi Gandhi, who is a well-known strategic risk advisor and professional in the space of healthcare, life sciences, and AI, and most recently is now involved in founding a startup focused on epilepsy, a healthcare AI tech startup, which we'll hear more about. But I'll turn this over at this stage to Cliff to kick us off with what should be a very fruitful conversation.
Oh, thanks, Rob, for the introduction and the partnership that we have with you and ZRG Partners at CERC these days. And especially thank you, Abhi, for joining us as our guest for this webinar. Let me provide those of you out there on the webinar a little bit more context for where we're going with this discussion, these questions. AI, as you know, is just all over the news these days. Much attention has come from ChatGPT, basically called a generative AI type of model. And what's interesting about this is that these AI applications, some of you may know this, some of you may be kind of new to this whole space, but they rely on neural network models to perform their analysis generally. They effectively try and mimic human brain function. They feature all sorts of structures, such as these interconnected layers of nodes called neurons, like we find in our own brains, that process and transmit information leveraging unsupervised and semi-supervised learning capabilities. These AI models are some of the most complicated analytical frameworks that any of the industries that are playing with these days have available to them. But what's interesting too is that they've been around for decades. Just to give you an example, I was using them in a very nascent stage back in the 1990s to determine SNL failure characteristics. So it's not like these have just kind of vaulted onto the scene recently. But with the advent of high performance computing capabilities, these models have really started taking off. Many industries, not just medical technology, but many industries have identified a number of highly useful applications for these models, including medical technology, that have the promise of really revolutionizing the area on how we analyze and build these new products. And while not specifically in the medtech area, just recently Insilico Medicine announced that they're in the phase 2 clinical trial of an AI-generated drug for targeting chronic lung disease. What they did is they used a generative AI, I think they call it Chemistry 42, to sift through massive amounts of research and data to identify targets for lung disease and the molecules to act on it. So the company provided, the tool with desired characteristics it was looking for, and then the AI tool generated a series of possible molecules ranked on the probability of success. So it seems like science fiction in some sense that this is coming about, but it demonstrates the real potential for such models to crunch through voluminous amounts of information to identify patterns that humans would otherwise really struggle with doing themselves. So what I'd like to do, kind of setting that up as context with you, Abby, is to learn more about the applications in medical technology field, but even more so the risks associated with these models and how we can actually mitigate them. So if you would please, for our audience today, could you comment a little bit to kind of kick us off on applications of artificial intelligence in the medical technology area? That is kind of some of the use cases that we're seeing, what kinds of some of the potential benefits from these models are we seeing, that sort of thing.
Absolutely, Cliff. First of all, thank you for having me on this, and thank you, Rob and Scott and the team that's put this together. Cliff, it is, as you were putting it, it is actually exciting, right? We're going from what we saw in the movies as science fiction to reality. And, but, to also set an expectation that we have to temper that appropriately. So based on the risks, that we're facing in something that's fairly unknown even today. But just in terms of sort of the exciting use cases, some which are already happening today, right? At an early stage of, you mentioned a really good example of drug discovery, right? Just the high computing power that's available today, but the sets of data that AI can sift through, that is actually has a lot of promise in terms of the development of new molecular entities. And that's already happening in the labs. We will, in my mind, over the next 5 to 10 years, see a lot more action and throughput from there. But along the clinical journey of a patient, right, if we had to map it, everything from, the screening and diagnosis, which is where I think AI and ML really, and machine learning really is being utilized today, right? Those applications are currently happening. So when it comes to diagnosis, again, taking a lot of data, looking at patterns that, machine learning really does really well and providing insights on it. So I think the best example that comes to mind that's pretty real today is around imaging, right? Radiological imaging. It's happening in dermatology, oncology is picking it up as well. In fact, I was part of a project, which is a very live project at Google around diabetic retinopathy, where you're looking at images of the eye, retinal images of the eye, and the machine's really actually picking up, sometimes with higher accuracy than a trained professional, is picking up actually aneurysms in the vessels in the retina of the eye, which is an indicative of diabetes, underlying diabetes, right? So, we're talking about lung cancer, breast cancer, really solid tumor, where the nodules are sort of, the data is available through these digital sets. The good news there is that the cost of this is being reduced dramatically. So we are talking about impact on a global scale, right? This is not just meant for the elite and the exclusive and the sort of rich nations in healthcare systems. It is meant to be for the underserved areas as well. So again, going back to the sort of the clinical, the journey or patient journey around the screening and diagnosis. This could be used in broad scale applications. We're talking about now interventions. We're talking about robotic surgery already today has a lot of AI built into it in terms of robots actually getting the level of precision with surgical procedures, at the level of a really experienced surgeon, right? And at least as a supplement today, right? I don't want to set an expectation it is at any point going to replace that trained physician, but it's going to supplement or support them. We're talking about predictive analytics, right? Around actually getting a lot of this data based on historical information and sort of, again, providing insights around it. But I think one of the most exciting areas is around personalized healthcare, right? Personalized treatments, where, again, looking at genetic profiles, looking at sort of protein markers, looking at the lifestyles for individual patients, and running against massive databases and sifting through it and coming up with sort of predictions, but really recommendations as a clinical decision support is what we call it in the industry, right? And so that's already happening today at some level, but I think that's an area which is going to grow substantially. So again, this is just, these are just certain examples, Cliff. Hopefully they're helpful, but there's a bunch of other stuff happening, but these are the areas that I think are one already in play. Again, and I will say, to get this to becoming more sort of, ubiquitous and, and sort of pervasive across the healthcare system, there needs to be an element of trust, which I will get to around the risk piece, right? But the technology, I think, has been progressing very, very rapidly.
Yeah, it's fascinating from what listening to what you're saying. It's not just emerging, it's here, particularly with what we're seeing in the news. I mean, it's happening. And so whether you're at a medical technology company or a pharmaceutical manufacturer, or you're at the FDA, you just can't sit back and say, well, we're gonna start managing the risk on it now. I mean, it's here. It's clearly a present danger. One of the questions I want to ask as a follow-up to that, though, is all of those great benefits that you're touting, both for patient care, for lower costs, even for companies, more precision in the products and services that are provided. What about the emerging risks, though? Those kind of like the downside of this. Where do you see those lie?
Yeah, those are significant, Cliff. And I think that's, again, I like to say that the industry is typically always ahead of regulation, right? And so this is where regulation is, to the credit of the regulators across the world. They are really trying to play catch up, but be, at least lock in step with the industry. There is a lot of collaboration happening there. That said, the risks, and I'm going to put it into certain sort of categories, but maybe just defining, defining AI and ML. The fact is, we're looking at a large amount of data, right? We're looking at historical retrospective data and trying to make some prospective sort of, recommendations based on that, right? Predictions, if you may. So one of the big things, I think, just inherently in the technology is what we call the black box, right? Because with AI, you know what the inputs are, you know what the outputs that you want are, but you really don't know what's happening in between, right? And so machine learning, inherently, what it does is it's constantly improving upon the initial algorithms. The initial algorithm is written by a human, right? It's a software program that's written by a human. Now, we don't actually know what goes in that box, right? And so if you're not able to actually explain it, how as a physician how will a physician actually get to the level of trust to know what kind of data has even been entered and what kind of methodology is being used towards that? And I think that's what explainability, right? These principles that have been emerging now from some of the frameworks speak to explainability. I think that's something that's the single biggest challenge, right? For regulators, for providers, and for patients, right? So how do we actually know what's going on in there? And how do we get a point where we can balance what is potentially intellectual property? It's the magic sauce for a lot of companies when they're doing this, versus actually the faith and trust in the system to know we know some level of predictability around that. So that's a big area. And some of the side effects of the downstream issues with that is accountability. What actually happens if there is an inaccuracy in diagnosis, right? For that matter, who would even say that their final output is agreed upon based on, and medicine works a lot based on consensus, right? Consensus standards, consensus guidelines. And so the question is, we used to joke about this when I was working in pulmonology. Like, you put 5 pulmonologists in front and you'll get 6 opinions, right? So now I've added a 7th. I've added machine there, right? And so who's to say that the machine is right versus one of the experts? And medicine is an art, right? As much of a science, in terms of, if you look at treatment around oncology, there's a different sort of combination of drugs, of therapeutic regimens that are used, right? So it isn't clear right now as to an accountability is, one, who makes that final decision as to what is right, and 2, if there is a potential misdiagnosis, who's on the hook for it? Is it the machine? Is it the manufacturer of the software that the machine learning algorithm? Is it the providers, the hospitals that are using it? So this is one of the biggest hurdles, I think, currently, in terms of the more widespread adoption of the technology of AI and ML. So that's the other one. I think the third one, at a very basic level, is privacy, right? We are, as an industry, just again, implicitly, we are looking at AI pulling a whole bunch of data, typically historical data. How far back do we have to go in that data audit chain to know whether we have consent from the individual patients? Right. Do those patients even know that we're actually using this data for training the data sets, right? So, I mean, there's definitely a legal framework around some of these things. I will say, and I will get to the ethical conundrum around that as well, but clearly from a liability standpoint, it is not 100. It's not very clear today who holds the ownership and who holds the onus in terms of ensuring we are getting the level of patient consent. For sure, when it comes to prospectively using that data, there seem to be more standards and more guidance today. So I would say that's again a clear one around the risk area. The other part I think is just bias. I know we're probably reading a lot about that in the news, right? Again, the algorithms written by someone, the data that we're feeding it is sort of a pre-selected data set, right? And we know for a fact, just based on subconscious bias, that those data sets themselves might incorporate that level of bias. So AI is simply going to essentially carry over that bias. In fact, sometimes it's going to amplify that bias that's in that initial data set, right? Or initially in sort of the behavior patterns. And so there's a lot of discussion today right now, and at the FDA level in terms of, we're talking about inclusion and diversity for sure, but we're also talking about as an industry, how to actually mitigate these bias issues, right? So there needs to be, I think that's, again, a pretty large sort of area of risk. And then I will say around, just overall security. And I'm not talking about just basic cybersecurity, but there's two kinds of security in my mind, right? One is just in terms of network and data security, right? Just the fact that, we have potential breaches, right? I would say it's a floor that every company, regardless of whether it's a nonprofit, government entity, or a for-profit, has to have a foundational security program in place where we're preserving the data that we're collecting in the first place. But now I'm talking about now data security in a different way in terms of adversarial attacks based on AI, right? There's pretty sophisticated hackers out there that are going to be, and it's not obvious to the naked eye or to even a programmer, right? But they're actually inserting blocks of code within these AI algorithms that are very, very hard to detect. And we wouldn't even know the patterns unless there's an active sort of monitoring tool behind it, right? So again, the hackers are probably ahead of some of the industry professionals as well around this stuff, right? And we all know that, we talk about data being a currency, we talk about medical data in the dark web being sold today for hundreds of dollars per transaction, right? So it's a pretty productive industry if you ask me there. And so we have to be super careful about that. But I think along with that, I would say is the other kind of security I want to mention, because we're talking MedTech, is device security, right? We've heard about, stories of how people's pacemakers can get compromised based on, attacks on them, right? So that is, if you look at the exciting kind of devices that are coming out today, we're talking about, again, massive amounts of security risk around that. So that has to be built in. But I'll go, I mean, there's a bunch of these other sort of specifics around it, but I want to end on the risk side, at least, in talking about the ethical conundrums, right? We mentioned a little bit about the bias issue. We spoke a little bit about, we touched upon the consent issue. But overall, we have to ask the question, right? If we are trying to do good with this, right? And yet we want to make these commercial enterprises, the question is, in my mind, is are we helping people, or are we in some shape or form also compromising and making them more vulnerable? And one example of that is that we, as an industry, we collect a lot of data, right? We're collecting it for certain very pre-specified purposes, and we're staying within that sort of narrow lane. What happens if we find a pattern or indication that's outside of it, but that is actually important for the patient, and meaning, so let's take an example of that. You're collecting data for a particular study, right? You're using AI and machine learning to sort of sift through that data. You come across some indication or some information that says a patient is probably more prone or more susceptible to certain disease, already has a certain disease, but that's not within the scope of what you were studying. Now, are you, one, obligated to, and two, should you, as a good citizen, I mean, assuming that falls within the definition of good citizen, should you be informing the provider for that patient and that patient or not? And that comes with the host. It's not an easy question to answer, right? Because we're talking about liability. We're talking about, privacy issues along with that. We're talking about the provider not being in the loop a lot of times around this stuff. So, we have to ask the question. Also, I think the one that's healthcare always grapples with is insurance, right? What happens if you get information on patients? Do we have to relay that to the insurance company? And if we do, is that going to preclude them from coverage for certain conditions that weren't disclosed or weren't known at that point in time? So I can go on, Cliff, but those are the sort of large areas that I can think of. Yeah.
No, this is terrific. I mean, as you're talking about this risk landscape, my mind naturally kind of goes to the nature of all these interrelated risks, right? That can have cascading effects on each other, right? And it kind of starts with the tool itself. And in my line of business on the banking side, model risk is one of the prevalent risks, what we call a level 1 risk that a lot of people worry about these days. And rightly so. As you talked a little bit about the model, I want to dig into that a little bit more. You talked about adequacy and sufficiency, availability of data, large amounts of data, and to kind of give an example of that bias, there's another form of bias I think that comes into this too. You gave one example. Suppose you've got data on a certain demographic group, and you're trying to understand that the implications of a particular disease associated with that group, and you find out later on that that just doesn't work on any other demographic. So it is a certain to the model developers' point, what data are they using and how do they specify that model? Here's a question for you that as it relates to this, and maybe you want to take this one on or not. But one of the things that we struggle with, I think, with trying to use these AI models, wherever they might be, is how do you determine the reliability of the model? How do you determine the performance of these models? There are kind of these metrics that are out there, Shapley values and partial dependence plus and all these other things. But unlike statistically based models, it's really hard to kind of pin down how accurate these results are. How do you address that sort of thing?
I think it's a great question, and there's a lot of, I think, technical details that people are sort of thinking about and developing, right? I think it comes to reliability and transparency, right? I'm oversimplifying that because I don't think that's been answered 100% for sure. But I'd say reliability in terms of, again, to your point of statistical testing, we know over years, right? We know we've reached a certain, statistical significance. When it comes to sort of healthcare regulatory authorities, we have drugs that are tested at 2 randomized clinical studies. That's considered the gold standard, right? There's a certain amount of sort of, rigor that goes into these, right, from a quality standpoint. But over decades, the industry has said that we believe that there's enough reliability in these models, there's enough predictability there, right? Of course, the nature of the beast with AI is that the predictability sort of changes, but that's where the second element comes in, which is transparency, right? If we are able to say that, here's the inputs, here's the outputs, here's the general, here's the methodology, right? Here's the process that we're following.
Right.
Here are the edge cases. I think the challenge with AI in a lot of these is what they call the free variables, right? The more free variables there are, the harder it becomes for the AI model to be more predictive, right? So I think that transparency is important in terms of how the model is developed, what kind of inputs you're putting in there, and what kind of algorithms are being used. But again, that's oversimplifying the issue because, like I was saying earlier, if that is the intellectual property, you're basically giving it away, right? So how deep can we go, even with regulators, in terms of explaining that?
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm giving you a very fulfilling answer there, but
I think you are. I guess one of the questions too on this is what kind of governance process can we even put together at these companies to build and use the technologies? So, for example, if you've got this big company, some companies are small, some companies are large, but should there be groups that actually are should there be like a centralized AI? I don't want to call it center of excellence because that's an overused word, but something like that, where there a data and an analytics hub on this that are building and deploying the technologies that are different from those that are kind of validating and approving them as we do for banks. In banks, we have a fairly rigorous model risk management process that goes along with the deployment of these models and the continued testing of these models. And what I wonder about is, if you've got, let's say, in one part of let's say a pharmaceutical business, a division that's working on one AI application, you've got another division building another sort of AI application, who is kind of like bringing this together in some sort of consistent fashion at the enterprise level?
Yeah, it's again, great question, Cliff. And maybe we're, both going from the risk industry, risk and compliance, that there's a certain bias here, right? But I do think from a governance, we have the governance in place in terms of the management governance, right? And I think what you're also alluding to is maybe a little bit of an audit mindset where you have a certain level of independence from different groups, right? So I think we should exploit and use that governance in companies with. I think there's a huge difference in terms of the skill set though as well that comes with that for what we're
Oh, no
speaking about.
question.
But I would exploit that governance that exists today in terms of having, the board oversight, having the management teams certify and attest to it, but have an active sort of compliance and risk program that is using this forum as an escalation group. I think the difference though is the skill set is are the kinds of people there, right? We, within organizations, you mentioned this, right? It's a group maybe that does the development and testing, right? What I'm seeing now is again, now being a part of pharma and being in part of the tech companies with the tech, again, the company doing, I was part of Google Verily, which is a life science tech company. And so I think tech companies recognize that they have the software development lifecycle part. They may not have the level of maturity around risk because they haven't been healthcare focused. Pharma companies have very much of that mindset, but don't really have the software development lifecycle skill set, right? So there's a convergence happening, I think, in industry where either of these companies are trying to meet sort of the balance, right? So I think having the professionals around the software development side, right? Being part of the discussion. I mean, there's a concept that we used to use a lot, we use a lot in tech, which is privacy by design. I would put risk or compliance by design here, right? I don't want to say compliance only because we don't have the level of compliance guidelines today to be able to comply with that, right? But I do think AI, whatever, like transparency by design, for example, incorporate that early on, often in that process, right? But have those people also come and be represented in this governance today because they haven't historically been part of that, right? So the tech folks, I think there's new roles that are emerging in industry, right? There's a chief data officer today that exists. I know of a couple of pharma companies that have a chief data ethics officer today, right? So this is a person that understands the technology infrastructure. They've been through software development life cycles for large implementations, but now they also understand the risk of some of that, these algorithms being developed for products that they're supporting in the pharma companies. So there's a bunch of these, I think, but the chief risk officer now needs to like have an extra sort of skill set with them. They need to have a team that a sub team within their larger function they're developing that does this. So, but I do think the principles you mentioned still hold, right? You have a team that's developing this, that's very product focused, right? Is working on is a companion diagnostic. It could be an independent product. It could be an AI product that's looking at purely screening and diagnosis to serve the larger population. Each of those holds true, but they should be integrated into, again, we should integrate transparency principles, AI principles in that on a regular basis. But two, we should bring these people along with us when we're having discussions around risk as well.
What do you make of NIST's AI risk management framework? I think we thrown this a link in the chat actually for the audience to kind of look at. I mean, what I'm hearing is that maybe we need to coalesce around individual companies are doing their own things and they're kind of governing their AI capabilities. But is there a need to have some sort of a standardized process for how we go about developing and deploying these models?
I absolutely think so. I think the NIST framework is excellent. I mean, I know it's new. I know it's still being sort of deployed and tested. But there's two things. There's the reason I like the NIST framework is because it integrates two things. It integrates the risk frameworks that we are used to, right, in the industry. The COSO framework, the enterprise risk management. It brings that discipline and the process, but it now integrates the principles of AI, right? So you'll see Europe actually has recently introduced an act, right? If that passes, it's going to be unprecedented, but it actually does set certain standards in place, right? At least principles, I'd call it. I don't think we're at the level of specific standards yet. But the NIST framework speaks to that, right? It speaks to the principles on fairness, around reliability, transparency, this whole thing about predictability that we were speaking about. So I think time will tell, and I'm sure there'll be some evolution around it. But if companies are able to successfully use again this risk framework with these principles around AI, machine learning, I think it'll be very successful. That said, my experience though is typically the companies that are working around AI and stuff, are the smaller companies. They're the startups, right? They're, again, the more, let's call them the more innovative companies around this space, right? They're willing to actually take more risk and frankly don't have the resources that they have actually thrown into risk management, right? So we will see certain mistakes along the way, hopefully not big mistakes. But I think going back to your point, as a framework, one, I think companies should really look at the NIST framework, should think about implementing it internally as soon as they can. And again, they can come up. We did this with COSO, right? Every company had a slightly different interpretation of how they did it. But broadly speaking, those principles apply, and that would be good. I think it's good rigor and good sort of discipline, right? The one other thing I will share is that I do think there's also industries is trying to corral around like consortiums, right? There's consortiums that are getting together to talk about what kind of standards do we need to do. And really, it takes me back to the pharma code, 30 years ago before the most recent incarnation, where it was more self-regulation. Industry recognizes that we are moving really quickly, and there's a level of partnership with the government as well.
Right. Yeah. So if you're a board member, one of these companies that's out there, I mean, what kind of questions do you think, board members should be asking management teams about AI and their use in their management? I mean, what would you be wanting to know about that if you were someone on deck these days?
Yeah, I would ask, one is, what are the use cases we're considering, right? Specifically, what products are we speaking about? Are these standalone products? Are they what we call companions to products, right? So if I'm a pharma board member, I'd ask, like, how am I enhancing my product using AI, right? Am I doing that? One. Two, what are the use cases? But also it's sort of getting some understanding of what level of sophistication are we talking about? Are we talking about, with nothing wrong with it, but on the value chain, right, there's chatbots, right, which are essentially for efficiency, which is, maybe better customer experience. The level of risk is generally lower for something like that. Are we talking about using this as a companion, diagnostic, for example? The level of risk is much higher. Or are we talking about now, essentially clinical trial management using AI, right, which has a much higher level of risk, and it really needs to include have the principles around fairness and inclusion, etc., right? All the way to, are we talking about sort of product that we're using AI for, like, robotic surgery, right? So I think the nature of the product, the nature of my business is sort of important, and I would sort of lean in as a board member a little differently for each of these. But then I think asking the question around, who are the folks in the organization? I think, going to your point, like, which of the teams are actually developing this?
Right.
Has there been enough sort of attestation or even testing around this to give us a level of conviction? Depending on how deep you want to go, but I would at least ask management to demonstrate what kind of frameworks they're using towards transparency and resilience and reliability, right? But I think importantly also, at some point, I would ask that, as part of my monitoring and auditing plans, how much are we doing around this area, right? And it has to be commensurate, obviously, with going back to how much of the product sort of is incorporating these technologies. But I would absolutely be having this very similar conversations to what they're having today around compliance and governance, but a very new sort of area of focus.
Yeah, one of the things, and again, what I'm finding is as we are here at CERC, sort of building out our programming across different broad sectors, including financial services and pharma, which both are highly regulated at the federal level, as we know. There are commonalities, at least at the high level, in terms of transferable ideas. You mentioned COSO, right? We're using those frameworks for years over on the banking side. But interestingly enough, and I think the banking sector has been there a lot longer with this, at least the regulatory community in the banking sector is leveraging guidance around AL and machine learning capabilities. And I think that kind of general framework that we've been talking about here, going beyond just kind of like a NIST standardized framework, risk framework, to the model risk management side of it is going to be kind of critical, I think, for this. And so another question I have back to pharma for a moment is, there's all sorts of areas. We talked a little bit about this, right? In pharma development, manufacturing applications of AI, right? Improvements there, surveillance, quality, clinical trials, as we've been talking about, and drug development, of course. And that's about to explode on the scene here. And I guess the question would be, is FDA ready for this? What is the role for regulation in AI technology in this area? What are FDA's expectations, and where do you actually see it heading?
Yeah, I think the FDA is super active, give them credit because they don't want to be playing catch up. They want to be, really sort of be seen as supporting innovation, but providing the right level of balance. It's not an easy job. Again, going back to the FDA's remit is really around efficacy and safety, right? It is about public safety. Around this area, they recognized a few years ago that they have to do something, right? The FDA has recognized one thing, that the traditional regulatory framework around assessing, evaluating, and approving medical devices is not going to hold for AI, right? They recognize that the ever-changing sort of the data sets, the algorithm, algorithmic way of working around this stuff. So the FDA has done a few different things, right? It started at the CDR Edge, which is their office that really looks at the drug office, right? Had created an office called the office is called the Digital Health Office. I think it's been elevated to an office actually. But they also created a program called the pre-certification program. And the FDA had selected, I believe, if I remember correctly, 9 companies that they worked with to essentially go and sort of speak to them and say, look, we recognize that we don't have the right pathways. We want to work with you, understand what kind of products you're developing. And we'll come up with a framework together in terms of how to actually evaluate and approve software as a medical device. And while the pre-cert program itself doesn't exist anymore, the learnings on that actually have been used by the Digital Health Office. And recently, the FDA has put out a couple of guidance papers. One is still in the public, is in the period of public opinion, where they're looking for input on it before they finalize it. But the FDA says, look, and again, I'm going to sort of summarize this because there's a lot of sort of technicalities that go with that. But the FDA's viewpoint is that if you can tell us, the standards that you're going to use in terms of quality control, right? And these are so when you go to the FDA and say, I'm looking for clearance, or even what's called a pre-sub or Q-sub meeting with the FDA, you want to put out there that what are those predetermined set of procedures and controls that you're building into the product. And the FDA really wants to understand at a level of detail specific to that disease area. But 2, they're saying to the company, look, we believe that we need transparency. We need you to be telling us, if we did approve this, we cleared this for a certain intended use, which is equivalent of a product like a PI or an indication for a drug, then we expect that you will have a certain quality, a quality sort of management system in place that will be recording on the regular basis, that you will be feeding back to us real-time or real-world sort of performance metrics. So we can then evaluate whether, 1, the level of data and information on this supports the intended use that we had cleared you for, but 2, it gives us some comfort that as the product is evolving, right, that we can actually determine that it is safe for public consumption. Meaning that, again, going back to the fact is that you cannot, so the FDA has approved what I'm calling the static AI or algorithms today, right? They're locked and loaded. You know how they're going to behave. But once you put them out from a machine learning standpoint, you really don't know what happens, right? So this is the FDA's way of saying, we're going to take those steps to get there. We're not going to approve wholesale these devices yet, or software as a medical device, but we will sort of learn along this longer way with you, right? So I think the real world performance monitoring is a huge step in that direction that hadn't existed maybe 10 years ago.
Well, on that go ahead, Avi.
Sorry, I was just going to say the EU also. I think I briefly touched upon the fact that the EU, even before the FDA, the EU more as a large entity, not just healthcare, has been very focused around AI principles, right? And they put out policies. They're now there's a regulation, this act that's coming out, which, as one example, they are prohibiting certain types of biometrics like facial recognition, right? And that's not so much just healthcare, it's broader. But I expect, if I had to look, see it, ahead, I would expect there to be even more collaboration between regulatory entities across definitely Europe and the US.
Interesting. It may be too early to sort of talk about these, but are there, when you're speaking to monitoring, my mind typically comes to key risk indicators. What could be used as KRIs for companies to use to monitor these models? Are we looking at just specifically KRIs of the strict model performance? How accurate are they? Or are we looking at other measures as well as it relates to the health and safety of patients on that side? I mean, how do you view coming up with good monitoring metrics from a risk management standpoint here?
Yeah, Cliff, another great question. And I think it provokes thought for compliance and risk professionals, right? Because we'd have to at least be pretty embedded within our own businesses to even know what those metrics would look like, right? So I think I'd say programmatically the programmatic metrics are probably what we're used to, right? Depending on the kind of companies we're talking about, the KPIs, KRIs around, whether it's observations and corrective actions, et cetera, right? I think that stays, that discipline stays.
Right.
But for the AI part, I definitely think we should be incorporating metrics around, the criteria around data sets, right? For example, if we are talking about mitigating risks around data bias, what kind of data sets are we using, right? How comfortable are we that those data sets represent real world, right? As the FDA has said multiple times now, and they have a paper out on this, is if you're doing a clinical study on a product, we want the clinical study groups representing real world, right? We don't want this to be sort of a microcosm of sort of, folks that are not overly represented, because when we do approve the drug, for example, we're going to base it on, again, the predisposition, the prevalence and incidence of disease across that population. So we should use the same principles in-house, right? And say, how sure are we that the data sets collected that were used to train the model are actually representative of the larger population? And I think that helps in terms of removing a lot of bias. But I think to your point around monitoring also is, what groups are essentially in the organization responsible and actually managing quality standards? There's sort of a new role I've gotten exposed in the last few years around quality management, even in life science companies, is that of a quality engineer. There's quality data engineers, there's quality engineers, and these people are extremely focused on exactly that, right? They're looking at what kind of methodologies are we using. This standard, this predetermined change control plan, as the FDA calls it, is something that these people are driving. They're working with the software engineers, they're working with the product management folks, and are coming up with these plans.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. You talked about this a little earlier, about this convergence, right? Of the software developers with the folks that are actually more on the traditional side of the house and developing the drugs, and how these companies are kind of evolving as a result of that. That would have to come in the same fashion, I would think, on the quality management side, right? That you have to have people that are well versed in a commentary earlier on about, like, even audit. You just can't have somebody just drop in from audit and start to vet, what's going on in these technologies, because they're just so specialized and so complex. You're going to need new people, or people that are well versed on both the audit function and the quality function, to be able to kind of go toe to toe, right, with these players.
You're absolutely right. There's no question. You're right. I mean, the days when you had audit being run by some of the financial folks, right? Again, it's critical, right? Internal audit is super important. But that skill set for that group needs to evolve dramatically, right? Because it's not just, these aren't financial audits. They're not just pure play privacy and security audits, right? Now we're talking about folks understanding, to your point, understanding these models, right? Having a technical background, but also looking ahead and seeing, sometimes the product teams haven't identified the unintended consequences, right?
Yeah.
And it's not one person's job either, but audit, monitoring, compliance, risk people need to have that dimension as well in terms of their back.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm going to take a question here from one of the folks that are on as an attendee, and it says, in healthcare settings, statistical significance is distinct from clinical significance. The role of the physician is contextual interpretation of a given presentation The AI models are able to provide a great differential on this, leaving the next step implementation to the judgment of a healthcare professional or the individual. Who holds the responsibility for the next step of implementation? Do you anticipate regulation for this?
If I understand the question, I'm going to take it as the physician is going to be, yeah. So there's the given presentation could be, one type of an AI model that's either in an independent sort of standalone product, or it's incorporated in a product. The physician is the one interpreting it, and that's a good way to put it, because yes, so there's a reason why these are called clinical, like software as a medical device. A lot of these sort of disease management tools today are what's called clinical decision support, right? There's either a visualization of data in a certain way, or there's a massive amount of data that's essentially presented as a dashboard, like a summary information. A physician looks at it and makes a determination. Regardless, most products that I think the FDA has been comfortable with are what's called clinical decision support, meaning that you're providing a certain amount of data, you're basing it on either certain consensus standards or certain models that a physician's aware of, and giving a physician a recommendation on what to do next, what's called the next best action. But it is really up to the physician to make that determination. It is very important for a company and a product to straddle that line very carefully. Is you're not actually, unless you're actually approved to do that, right? If you're cleared by the FDA, it's different. But typically, you are not in a position to actually make a decision for that patient. You should not be doing that. There's liability issues, and absolutely expect regulation on this, right? I think regulation in some shape or form exists more as what's called the learned intermediary rule. When a physician or a healthcare professional makes that determination on treatment, on sort of medication, whatever else might be. So, but I do think this is important to call out, is a product and a company that is supporting this, be it by way of a software product and AI product, is not playing the role of the physician or healthcare professional.
Interesting. So when I think about the overarching sort of like risk associated with AI technology, I think of, again, do companies have they formalized, I guess, in some sense, sort of their risk appetite for how much of this they're willing to take, and have they embedded that somehow into their processes? I guess my question is are there guardrails out there around what tolerance the company has for this risk and where some of those risks might be coming? We spoke of many of these, right? We talked about the inherent model risk that there is, but there could be also reputation risk associated with this. Of course, there's the health of patients and whatnot that goes along with it, the implementation of this, legal liability, those kinds of things. What kind of guardrails, if any, have companies kind of come up with to try and deal with that?
Yeah, Cliff, I suspect that is these are conversations the boards and executive teams are having now, right? Because I don't believe we're at that level of maturity yet.
Okay.
At least my data point. I think the larger companies have the resources and have the, I think the wherewithal to actually be having these discussions. I don't know if it's been completely implemented yet. The smaller companies, as I was explaining earlier, don't necessarily have the luxury in their mind of thinking. They have to be thinking about it, because you're right. I mean, one mistake can have a massive reputational impact, which could take that business down, right? It is potentially that big. So I do think that risk tolerance needs to be, and it's not, we know that, right? It's not a number, right? It's not like someone says, today I'm on 8 on 10 and tomorrow I'm going to take a high risk and we'll be 4 on 10, right? It's more a discipline. It's a process, right, to get there. So I absolutely think you're right in terms of the companies need to have, they need to have a forum, first of all, right? What's the forum going to look like? You could, again, leverage your content risk and compliance committee at the board level or the management level, right? There's different forums. I know companies that have advisory councils within organizations that are taking input from folks that are in line management and in the front line, because they're developing these models. They're talking to doctors all the time, right? I think it's important to get that sort of forum and elevate that discussion as well. But I do think, calibrate the risk, right? Are we in the right place? Are we benchmarking against the industry? But also there's a little bit of a blurring between the lines in terms of type of industry, right? There is in my mind, there's not going to be a pure play medical device or pure play pharma company. Everyone's going to be like a pharma tech almost, right?
Yes.
Likewise, some of the largest tech companies have dabbled in healthcare, and they realize it's not that easy, and you have to have the discipline of a life science company hasn't sort of been there yet, right? The scientific communications, this thing about evidence generation. I think now we're all picking up on the fact how important that is. So yeah, I think each of these there's a lot to learn from both sides of it, but actually bringing that forth in terms of a risk, what kind of threshold, what's the calibration, and asking these questions on a regular basis is important.
Yeah, I'm fond of saying, right, a lot of this is there's an art and a science to all of this, right? The science is clearly in the modeling of all of this, the high level of complexity, but trying to determine, right, impacts downstream on things like, say you've got some sort of vendor involved with this or reputation risk. Those are tougher ones to kind of like put a number on, and you're fooling yourself, I think, if you try to do that. I am, remind us, a comment you just made, a comment you made here about this kind of this fusion, if you will, of pharma and tech is reminiscent of fintech and sort of its evolution from the traditional banking side, and sort of the application of technology in the determination of products and services in the finance area. That has proliferated in ways that I don't think the regulatory community for banking well understood until it was kind of like the horse was out of the gate galloping down the path. And it sounds like we're kind of at this nascent stage again in the pharma side of building that out, and that FDA is trying to keep abreast of that. Is that sort of where is that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you mentioned something that triggered a thought. This thing about risk is not the way. So earlier, what would happen is pharma device companies, had that pipeline. They do clinical studies, typically with CROs, like research organizations. They were not touching the patient directly a lot of times, right? But they had these agents sort of, that well understood compliance and risk. But now we're talking about companies that are doing joint ventures, right? We're talking about a tech company working with a hospital system, right? And potentially a device company as well, right? If you look at diabetes management, that's so true. You have a CGM, a glucose monitor, which is a device. You have the healthcare provider providing data or a payer, and then you have a tech company actually mining that data. And then you have, essentially coaches and wellness experts who are quasi healthcare professionals. Right? The risk is not just one company, it's either all of these, right? And they're not just suppliers, these are partners, right? There's a lot of data sharing that's happening there as well. So, and I think to your point, the FDA recognizes that. And so I do think there's going to be questions and standards that evolve in terms of how deep do you have to go in your supply chain or your collaboration partners, right? Who owns the responsibility for some of these? Yeah. So not to sort of go on a tangent, but I do think those are the areas that are going to be very, very important as we go along.
Yeah, I mean, supply chain, right? Supply chain risk management. It seems like this is a natural to try and address some of the issues that we're seeing in the market these days on that. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Let me ask you this question, and I'm trying to kind of keep an eye on timing and whatnot. But just in terms of like, we talked a lot about many things over the last 45 minutes or so. And one of the questions I have is, what would you say are kind of like the big takeaways or actions that a company that's either involved with AI in some fashion or is about to embark on that path? What do you say is some of those takeaways and actions that they can actually use in managing their AI risk exposure?
I think I go back to almost asking what a management or a board team would do is what is the product that we're talking about and how does it belong within this chain, right? And it's not so much a classification, but it's more about what the risk profile is, right? Where does it fall? And then along with that, what are the intended uses, but what are the unintended consequences that can come of that, right? And it's putting it into those buckets so you can then say, I have some mitigation steps I'm going to take. I'm going to take some of those more actively early on versus some that I could defer just practically speaking, just because I don't have one, I may not have the answers, but two, I don't have the resources around it.
Right.
So I think that is really important. And I think companies suffer from doing that much later in the process. And so they haven't fully understood, and we recognize, right? Companies also pivot, business models pivot, the market changes as well. So I think it's important to do this on a regular basis. It doesn't necessarily take, I don't want to leave the impression that it takes, it's not this massive amount of effort and documentation that takes you away from product development. It's a discipline. It's something you do on a regular basis, right, by design. So I actually do think, and then I think the question or the point you raised around that independence, right? Do we have either internally or externally a body, an individual, someone that's responsible and has the voice and the forum where they can raise that these risks have not been mitigated appropriately, or that there are some sort of hidden issues that we've not even scratched the surface and that need to bring forth. I think it's important to have that mindset, but give people that. And we've seen enough companies out in the news for the wrong reasons, right? Where they haven't done that appropriately. So
yeah, no, that's a good point. The other point that I'd make on that too, I guess, is that what we see is sometimes there's a lot of pushback from companies on elevating the amount of risk management that they take on in their organizations. Sometimes companies, places that I've been at, look at it as almost like a tax. And so trying to cultivate an environment, and maybe pharma is different in the sense that they are so laser focused on patient safety and care, efficacy and those kinds of things, that they have heightened sensitivity to that. But I'd say that in other areas like banking, risk management isn't sort of like, something that is proactively often put into the institution as much as forced by regulation. So the other thing that comes to mind to me in terms of takeaways, it seems like what we've talked about here is developing like a standard enterprise-wide protocol or policy, whatever you want to call it, around the governance and oversight of the models and the underlying data, and that sort of thing, and then creating sort of this, sort of collective that is kind of responsible for developing it, and that consortium, I think you referred to it as, where you get an interdisciplinary focus from different aspects to vet this technology out well in advance before it goes into place. Seems like kind of where we're at. Is that safe to say, a good characterization?
Absolutely. Fully agree. Yes. And it does need, like we spoke about, it's interdisciplinary, right? It's a very different set of actors now that need to come together, and that needs to happen. And I think industry is the right place to do that, to start. The government is reaching out as well. There's, as I mentioned, the pre-cert program examples of where we're talking about true public-private partnership, and really it's a healthy ecosystem, right? But an ecosystem needs multiple stakeholders to come together. Yes.
True enough. Well, Abhi, I'm going to ask the audience out there that if they have any questions that they would like to pose to you in the remaining couple of minutes or so, please send them in, and we'll take them. I think this has been a wide-ranging discussion on a fairly complicated topic, right? Even if we're covering AI on its own, there's a lot of discussion that we could have on this. And just kind of this relationship it has to medical technology is quite fascinating to me anyway. Are there any other further thoughts as we close this out that we should be thinking about in managing AI risk that we haven't covered here today?
No, I think I just want to say that we have to, as risk professionals, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of a patient or a caregiver, or a user, right? And ask this question: is what would I be comfortable with, right? Well, it's all exciting. We're coming at it from an industry standpoint or academia, and really excited about the great things that the potential this has. But let's remind ourselves that there's someone, and sometimes it's not if can we do it, because frankly the technology might exist, but should we do it, right? Is it the right thing to do? And if we did, how do we ensure that we are getting the level of trust in the system? Well,
that's a great way to end today's session. Again, I want to thank Avi for being our guest today, and for all of you attending this, and Rob and Scott for partnering with us again. So thank you very much, and we'll be back shortly with another installment of our CERC Risk Leadership webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you all very
Thank you.
much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.